The dismissal arrived at 6:18 a.m., cutting through the silence of my study as I annotated the percussion cues for Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. "Julian, it's Dad. Look, about the family dinner next month." I set my pencil down on the score, watching the fog roll over the Charles River. "What about it?" "We think it's best if you skip this one," he said, his voice flat. "Grant's wife, Seraphina, just finalized a $350 million acquisition in the tech sector. It's the peak of her career. She's hosting the board, the venture capitalists, the real movers of the city. These are high-stakes professionals." He paused, the weight of the comparison hanging in the air. "You do the arts, Julian. It's a different world. We don't want any awkwardness when the conversation turns to, well, actual industry." I looked at my wall, lined with 3 world tour posters, a lifetime achievement baton, and the letter confirming my tenure as the youngest principal conductor in the city's history. "I understand perfectly," I replied quietly. I looked at my watch. In 48 hours, the very movers he was worried about would be paying $500 a seat just to see me lift my hand. Before we get into the moment my family realized their mistake, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing how far our community reaches across the globe. Let me know. After I hung up the phone, I didn't move. I simply sat in the center of my study, the silence of the room feeling heavy. My father's words, different levels of success, echoed against the walls. I looked at those walls. They were covered in framed programs from the Berlin Philharmonie and La Scala, alongside my Global Conductor's Prize. In a simple, elegant frame sat my most recent achievement, a letter of commendation from the Sydney Opera House for a sold-out 3-week residency. My father and Grant thought I played music, like a child in a garage band. They couldn't grasp that I was the CEO of an artistic corporation. I didn't just play. I led a 90-man engine of sound with a multi-million-dollar budget and a global touring schedule. I thought back to the few times I'd met Grant's wife, Seraphina. She was a powerhouse in real estate, no doubt. At their wedding, she'd barely looked up from her tablet, eyes darting through quarterly reports while the cake was being cut. Every time Grant introduced us, he did so with a patronizing pat on my shoulder. "This is my brother, Julian," he'd tell his colleagues. "He does some freelance stuff with local orchestras. It's a nice little creative outlet." He never mentioned I was the music director of the Metro Symphony. He never mentioned the 4 years I'd spent in residency in London. To him, if I didn't have a corner office and a fleet of analysts, I wasn't working. I was just a drifter with a baton. I picked up my pencil and returned to The Rite of Spring. If they wanted me to sit this one out because I wasn't in their league, I would comply. But they had no idea whose league they were actually insulting. The Thanksgiving uninvitation wasn't an isolated incident. It was the crescendo of a decade-long symphony of disrespect. In my family, success was measured in cold, hard metrics: square footage, head counts, and corporate titles. My life, measured in phrasing, acoustic resonance, and cultural impact, simply didn't compute. I remember when I was 25. I had just been appointed as the youngest associate conductor for the Chicago Philharmonic, a position thousands of musicians would kill for. When I called home to share the news, my mother's first response wasn't, "Congratulations." She sighed and asked, "But Julian, does it come with actual health insurance? Or are you still just a contractor?" 6 years later, when I was named the artistic director of the Metro Symphony at 31, my father's reaction was even more sterile. He didn't ask about the inaugural gala or the repertoire I'd be conducting. He leaned back, swirled his scotch, and asked, Does a position like that have a 401k, or is it one of those pay-as-you-go artsy things? You need to think about stability, son. You're not getting any younger. Meanwhile, my brother Grant was the golden child of the dinner table. He worked in global logistics and supply chain management. My parents could explain his job to their friends at the club. They could brag about the number of shipping containers he moved or the efficiency of his last-mile delivery systems. That was tangible. That was real. They had created a comfortable fiction. Grant was the titan of industry, and I was the sensitive, slightly lost younger brother who had somehow turned a high school hobby into a precarious adult existence. They treated my international tours like vacations, and my rehearsals like practice. Eventually, I just stopped correcting them. It was exhausting to explain the complexities of a $40 million budget to people who thought I just waved a stick for 2 hours. I realized that my family didn't actually want to understand my world. They wanted me to fit into the box they had built for me. So I let them keep the box. I stopped mentioning the awards, the guest appearances in Paris, and the fact that I was currently being scouted for some of the most prestigious podiums in the world. If they wanted to believe I was a struggling freelancer, I would let them. I had a world-class orchestra that trusted my vision, and an audience that understood my worth. I didn't need my father's validation to know that the Rite of Spring was more difficult to manage than a fleet of cargo ships. I returned to my score, the silence of my penthouse far more rewarding than the noise of their judgment. There is a specific kind of peace that comes with being underestimated by people who should know you best. In psychology, it's often a form of gray rocking, becoming as uninteresting as possible to those who project their own insecurities onto you. I had reached a point where I no longer felt the need to bridge the gap between their perception and my reality. To my father and Grant, labor was only valid if it resulted in something you could touch, like a warehouse or a skyscraper. They suffered from a total lack of imagination regarding invisible labor. They viewed my life as a series of fortunate accidents, rather than a grueling climb to the top of a highly competitive global hierarchy. In their eyes, I hadn't built a career. I had simply avoided getting a real one. I realized that if I told them I was responsible for the artistic direction of a $40 million institution, they would just ask if I had to pay for my own tuxedos. This psychological distance wasn't born out of spite, but out of necessity. To conduct a piece as visceral as Stravinsky's, I needed total emotional clarity. I couldn't afford to have my mind cluttered with the sunk cost of trying to educate people who were committed to misunderstanding me. My family's dismissal had become a strategic shield. As long as they thought I was a failure, they left me alone to pursue greatness. I leaned into the silence of my study. Let them brag about their shipping lanes and their tech acquisitions at the club. Let them believe I was the charity case of the family. While they were busy performing success for their peers, I would be busy creating a legacy that would outlive every warehouse Grant ever built. I wasn't just playing music. I was architecting human emotion, and I didn't need an audience of 3 to validate an audience of thousands. The evening of the premiere arrived with the kind of electric tension that only exists in a sold-out house. The Metro Symphony Hall was a sea of black ties and evening gowns. 2,450 seats, every single one occupied by critics, donors, and patrons who had secured their tickets months in advance. I was in my dressing room, making the final adjustments to my white tie, when my assistant, Elena Vance, knocked and stepped inside. She held a clipboard, her expression a mix of professional efficiency and suppressed amusement. "The house is at capacity, Maestro," she noted. "The lead critic from the Chronicle is in row D, and the European delegates have arrived. Also, there was a bit of a situation at the box office about 20 minutes ago." I caught her eye in the mirror. "A situation?" "A man named Grant called," Elena said, tilting her head. "He claimed to be your brother. He was quite insistent about getting 2 VIP house seats for tonight. He seemed confused when the staff told him we've been at 100% capacity for over 2 months. I felt a cold smile tug at the corner of my mouth. And how did he handle that? He didn't believe them at first. He told the manager it was just an orchestra concert, and that there was no way we were actually sold out. He even tried to offer double the face value. Elena paused, watching me. He seemed genuinely shocked to find out your entire 3-week run is the most difficult ticket to get in the city. I didn't even realize you had a brother, Julian. Neither did he, Elena, I said, picking up my baton. At least, not the version of me that actually exists. At 8 p.m. sharp, I stepped onto the stage. The roar of the applause was a physical weight, a wall of sound that would have stunned my father into silence. I bowed to the audience, never once looking for a face that wasn't there. I turned to the 96 masters of their craft waiting for my signal. I raised my hand, and for the next hour, the only league that mattered was the one being created in this room. On the Tuesday following my opening night, an email landed in my inbox that shifted the entire trajectory of the family drama. It was from Claire Sterling, the Metro Symphony's Director of Philanthropy. Subject: High Priority Prospect, Auratech Holdings. Julian, we just had a fascinating inquiry. Seraphina Vance's office reached out. She's looking for a private backstage tour and a formal sit-down with the artistic director. Apparently, she's been a Premier Circle subscriber for the last 4 years and is considering a foundational-level gift. Her assistant was extremely persistent about a face-to-face meeting. Should I clear your Tuesday afternoon? I stared at the screen. Seraphina, my brother's wife. The woman who was supposedly too busy with $350 million acquisitions to make small talk with a musician at Thanksgiving. It turned out she wasn't just a fan of the arts, she was a patron of my house. Schedule it for Tuesday at 3 p.m., I replied. I'm very interested to hear what she has to say. That evening, the first wave of fallout hit. My phone lit up with a call from Grant. I let it ring. He called back 4 times before I finally answered. Julian, thank God, Grant panted. He sounded like he was pacing. Look, I don't know what's going on, but Seraphina is acting insane. We had the big board dinner last night, and she barely said 2 words to the investors. When we got home, she packed a bag and moved into the guest suite. She keeps calling me an unreliable narrator. What the hell did you tell her? I haven't spoken to your wife in 6 months, Grant, I said calmly, leaning back in my chair. Well, she found out I told you not to come to the dinner, and she's treating it like I committed a federal crime. She keeps asking me if I actually have eyes. Julian, can you just call her? Tell her it was a mutual decision. I can't have her this distracted before the Auratech merger closes. You made the choice to protect her professional sphere from my hobby, Grant. I'm just respecting your boundaries. I have a rehearsal to prep for. Good luck with the guest suite. I hung up before he could respond. The board was set, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being played. Tuesday afternoon arrived, draped in the professional chill of high-level philanthropy. I was in the executive boardroom, reviewing a draft of our upcoming European tour itinerary, when Claire ushered in our guests. Seraphina was as sharp as ever in a charcoal power suit, but the woman beside her, Maya Sterling, the COO of Auratech, carried an air of intense academic curiosity. They both stopped dead the moment they crossed the threshold. The boardroom walls were a gallery of my life's work. There was the shot of me in a sweat-drenched tailcoat at the proms in London, a framed cover of the Strad featuring my profile, and the silver-etched baton from my inaugural night at the Metro Symphony. Seraphina's gaze darted from the photos to me, then back to the photos. Her face went through 3 distinct shades of pale. Maestro, Sullivan? She whispered. The word maestro sounded like a question and a realization all at once. Welcome, Seraphina, I said, rising slowly. And you must be Miss Sterling. Please, have a seat. Maya Sterling didn't sit. She was staring at me with wide eyes. Wait, Seraphina, is this the man you've been telling me about? Your brother-in-law? The one Grant said was struggling to find his footing in the creative arts. Seraphina didn't answer for a long moment. She walked toward the wall, her finger hovering just inches from a photograph of me shaking hands with the president of the Austrian Arts Council. Grant told me his brother was a freelance musician. He said he did community theater pits and the occasional wedding gig to make rent. He said he was a perpetual student who couldn't commit to a real career path. She turned to face me, her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fury. I have had premier circle seats for 4 years, Julian. I have sat in the 3rd row of this hall, 20 feet away from you, watching you lead this orchestra through Mahler, Bruckner, and Sibelius. I have spent thousands of dollars on tickets to see Maestro Sullivan, and for 3 years, my husband told me that man was a total stranger. Maya let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Grant told everyone at the merger dinner that Julian couldn't attend because he wouldn't understand the level of conversation. He said Julian was a hobbyist. She looked at the gold-plated Global Conductor's Prize on the sideboard. My God, Seraphina, your husband is either delusional or the most insecure man on the planet. He's an idiot, Seraphina said, her voice dropping to a dangerous octave. She looked at me, her professional polish momentarily cracked by genuine grief. He let me sit through 3 family dinners talking about Maestro Sullivan's brilliance, and he never once said, "That's my brother." He let me believe the man I married was supportive of his family while he was actively erasing your existence because he couldn't handle the fact that you were more successful than he will ever be. I remained neutral, the maestro mask firmly in place. I stopped trying to correct his narrative a long time ago, Seraphina. It was easier for him to believe I was a failure. It made him feel like the pillar of the family. Well, Seraphina said, snapping her leather portfolio shut with a sound like a gunshot. The pillar just collapsed. I spent my Thanksgiving listening to him brag about a $350 million deal, while the most important artist in this city was sitting in a penthouse 3 miles away, uninvited. I'm done being an audience to his lies. She looked at Claire, who was standing by the door in stunned silence. We're still doing the donation. In fact, we're doubling it. I want a legacy in this hall. But as for Grant, he's about to find out exactly what different levels of success actually feels like. The aftermath of the meeting didn't take long to manifest. By 8 p.m. that evening, my phone was a vibrating brick of desperation. 22 missed calls from Grant, followed by a string of texts that shifted rapidly from "call me now" to "what the hell did you do" to "please, Julian, pick up." I waited until I had poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my armchair before I finally hit dial. "Julian, finally!" Grant's voice was ragged, the sound of a man who had been hyperventilating for hours. "What happened at the Symphony Hall? Seraphina came home, packed 3 suitcases, and moved into a hotel. She served me with separation papers an hour ago. She won't even look at me. She just keeps saying I'm a fraudulent partner." "We discussed a legacy gift for the orchestra, Grant," I said, my voice as level as a metronome. It was a very productive professional meeting. "A gift? Why would she give money to your little music group?" He paused, his voice cracking. "She said you're the music director. She said you're Maestro Sullivan. Julian, that's not possible. I've seen that name on the posters for years. I thought it was just a coincidence. Sullivan is a common name. I thought you were a stagehand or maybe a private tutor." "You thought the man who spent 4 years at Juilliard and won the Global Conductor's Prize was a stagehand?" I let a small, sharp laugh escape. "You didn't think it was me because you needed it not to be me. If I was successful, your narrative of being the only real professional in the family would have evaporated." "But music director," Grant stammered, "is that like a floor manager? Is it even a full-time job?" "It means I am the CEO of the sound, Grant. I hire the talent, I manage the $40 million vision, and I am the face of the institution. It is one of the 5 most prestigious podiums in the country. While you were bragging about last-mile delivery, I was being scouted by the London Symphony." There was a long, hollow silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears of his ego grinding to a halt. "She's leaving me because I didn't know your job title?" he whispered. "That's not fair." "She's leaving you because you are fundamentally incapable of seeing value in anything that doesn't serve your own vanity," I replied. "You uninvited your own brother from a family dinner because you were ashamed of a version of me that you invented. You didn't just lie to her, Grant. You lied to yourself. And now you're finally paying the market price for that lie." I hung up before he could beg for a character reference. I had a score to study, and for the first time in my life, my brother's serious problems felt like nothing more than background noise. The night of December 7th felt different. Usually, I stepped onto the podium and the world outside the hall ceased to exist. But as I walked out to the center of the stage, my gaze involuntarily flickered to row D, seat 12. There they were, Grant, looking small and pale in a charcoal suit, and my father, sitting rigid with a confused, almost defensive expression on his face. I didn't acknowledge them. I bowed to the audience, the applause washing over me like a familiar tide, then turned my back to the world. I raised my baton, and for the next 50 minutes we dove into Tchaikovsky's 6th Symphony, the Pathétique. It is a brutal, heart-wrenching piece of architecture. It begins in a whisper of bassoons and ends in a slow, agonizing fade into silence. As I led the 96 musicians through the 3rd movement, a triumphant, deceptive march, I could feel the energy in the room reach a fever pitch. I was no longer Julian, the younger brother. I was the conduit for a century of human grief and triumph. I could see my father's face from the corner of my eye. He was no longer looking at the program. He was leaning forward, his hands gripping the armrests, his mouth slightly agape. When the final note of the 4th movement finally dissipated into the rafters, I kept my hands raised for a full 10 seconds of absolute silence. Then, the hall exploded. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a roar of catharsis. I bowed, gesturing for the orchestra to rise, and then I looked directly at row D. Grant was standing, but he wasn't cheering. He was weeping. Not a quiet, dignified tear, but the heavy, shoulder-shaking sobs of a man who had just realized he had spent his life mocking a mountain he was too small to climb. My father stayed in his seat for a moment longer, looking stunned, as if he had just watched his son walk on water. 20 minutes later, they were waiting outside my dressing room. The air backstage was thick with the scent of rosin and expensive perfume. My father spoke first, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "Julian, I had no idea," he whispered. "I've heard the recordings you sent over the years, but I thought it was background music. I didn't realize you were doing that. The way they all looked at you, the way the sound moved when you moved your hand. That wasn't playing. That was something else entirely." "It's conducting, Dad," I said, wiping the sweat from my brow with a towel. It's a profession. Grant stepped forward then. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes red. I'm a fool, Julian. A complete and utter fool. Why, Grant? Because you missed a good show? No, he said, shaking his head. Because I sat there watching you, and for the first time in my life, I felt insignificant. Not because of your money or your title, but because you were creating something that will actually last. I spend my days moving boxes and chasing margins. You're building something eternal. I realized I've been calling your life a hobby, because if I admitted it was a career, I'd have to admit that my own life is just logistics. He leaned against the wall, his bravado completely vanished. I was threatened by you. I uninvited you from Thanksgiving because I knew, deep down, that if Seraphina saw you in your element, she'd realize I was the one who was just playing at success. I tried to keep you small so I could feel big. You didn't keep me small, Grant, I said, putting on my coat. You just kept yourself blind. You lived in a house with a masterpiece and treated it like a drafty window. My father looked between us, the realization finally dawning on him that his family hierarchy had been built on a foundation of sand. I want to fix this, Julian. I want to actually learn about what you do, not the benefits or the 401k, but the music. Is it too late? I looked at them both. The two men who had spent 38 years waiting for me to get a real job. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to remind them of their cruelty. I just felt a profound, quiet victory. The season isn't over yet, I said. But if you're going to be part of my world, you have to stop looking at the price of the ticket and start listening to the notes. The fallout of the Thanksgiving that wasn't didn't just break my brother's marriage. It rebuilt my family's reality from the ground up. 2 weeks after the Tchaikovsky premiere, Seraphina and I met for coffee. She looked revitalized, though the wedding band was conspicuously absent. The board approved the endowment, Julian, she said, sliding a folder across the table. Auratech is committing $3.5 million over the next 5 years. We're calling it the Vance Residency for New Music. I want your name to be associated with the future of this hall long after you've moved on. I thanked her, knowing this money would save our educational programs and provide stability for our youngest players. She mentioned that she and Grant were in mediation, not for a quick fix, but to see if he was capable of an ego reconstruction. She wasn't holding her breath, but she was giving him the chance to finally see the world without himself in the center of it. But the biggest shift came in January 2026. I received a formal offer from the San Francisco Symphony to become their music director. It was a career-defining move, a bigger podium, a larger global footprint, and a contract that made Grant's merger bonuses look like pocket change. I invited the family to dinner to share the news. The atmosphere was different now. There were no questions about health insurance or retirement plans. Instead, my father arrived carrying a stack of books on Russian composers. He had spent the last month listening to my recordings, and while he still struggled to tell the difference between a concerto and a sonata, he was trying. San Francisco, my mother said, her voice filled with genuine pride. One of the Big 5 orchestras. I read about it in the Times this morning. It's a massive responsibility, Grant added, his voice quiet. He hadn't quite regained his old confidence, but the arrogance was gone. They say the acoustic architecture in their hall is world class. I'd like to fly out for the opening night, if you'll have me. I'll have you, Grant, I said, as long as you come as a listener, not a critic. As we toasted to the new position, I realized that while they were finally looking at me, I was already looking past them. I had spent my life waiting for them to recognize my league, only to realize that by the time they arrived, I had already moved on to a different world entirely. My final performance at the Metro Symphony wasn't just a farewell. It was a testament to the power of staying true to your craft when the people closest to you are determined to see it as a hobby. We performed Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy, a symphony written by a man who couldn't even hear the thunderous applause he received. It's a reminder that true greatness doesn't require the permission of the ignorant to exist. As I stood on that podium, looking out at a sea of faces that finally included my own family, I realized that respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you command through the sheer excellence of your work. My brother had to lose his marriage to find his sight, and my father had to lose his pride to find his son. It was a high price to pay for a seat at the table, but the music sounds sweeter now that they're finally listening. If you've ever been the underdog in your family while you were secretly building an empire, hit that like button. It's time we celebrate the silent winners. What's the most insulting thing a family member has ever said about your career? Tell me your story in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you're here for more stories about turning the tables and winning on your own terms, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You're part of this community now, and we don't play small.